Good afternoon. It's Monday the 4th of June 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
And we're going to get straight on because Savid Javid, the new Secretary of State for the Interior, I'm calling him because this gets more dictatorial, it gets more Soviet every minute, Patrick. And he has decided that the security service, MI5, is going to start declassifying and sharing information on UK citizens suspected of having, well, what are they suspected of having? And we'll come on to that. Well, we get a clue from what's on the screen at the moment, because what he said was that ISIS, Islamic State group, and right-wing extremists are more similar than they might like to think. And he said that they have both exploit grievances, they distort the truth, and they undermine the values that hold us together. Now, my first question is, who is us in this case?
My question is, there's a few other groups that undermine the values and distort the truth, like government, but that's for another segment.
That's
Mike.
for another segment. But so they're going to share this information. Why are they going to do this? Because they're concerned about subjects of concern. 20,000 people that are considered to be subjects of concern. And he said that includes faster alerts for suspicious purchases, improving security at crowded places across the UK, and reducing the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure. So they're going to share this information with the private sector, they're going to share it with the public sector, because they're talking about sharing it with teachers and trying to get information from schools. And they're going to share it with the third sector, of course, the charity sector as well. We've been talking about this for some time. What is this all about? Well, he's talking about it being a step change, because of a step change in the threat to the United Kingdom. And he also said that they're going to increase maximum sentences for some offences. They're going to use data to track terrorism suspects, and they're going to outline a new approach in how they're going to deal with what they're describing as right-wing extremism. Now, look, before we get on to just what this is about, this business of right-wing extremism, Patrick, the clue that we get to this was from David Cameron's speech to the UN General Assembly in, I believe, 2014 or 2015, where he was expressing concern about right-wing extremists, particularly people that don't accept the official narrative of 9/11, for example, people that don't accept the official narrative of 7/7, people that he described as conspiracy theorists. So this isn't just about, gangs of football supporters that are out campaigning on traditional right-wing issues that you might. This goes actually quite far into the centre. And I suppose if you are sitting somewhere on the left-hand side of the spectrum, everything else appears to be on the right wing.
Sure. Well, right now, even the Tory party is on the sort of extreme left end of the spectrum in real terms, anyway. But both the left and the right, in political terms, they're really in favor of more sweeping state powers. I think that's the main, probably, point that you're getting at there, Mike. So, yeah, anybody who might have any thoughts or opinions that might be outside of a very narrow band of discourse. So that's who Mr. Javid is referring to, apparently.
I'll just say I wasn't referring to all football supporters, of course. But look, what's this about? It's about the fusion doctrine. We mentioned this in March when the fusion doctrine was announced. It was announced in this document, the National Security Capability Review. And let's just remind ourselves a little bit of the types of things that were being said in this. Theresa May said last year we commissioned the National Security Capability Review to establish how best we can apply our national security apparatus to address the increasing and diversifying threats to our country and to our way of life. Overall, the framework of the 2015 National Security Strategy and the Strategic Defence and Security Review remains right, but since it was published, threats have continued to intensify and evolve, and we face a range of complex challenges at home and overseas. The resurgence of state-based threats and increasing competition between states, the undermining of the international rules-based order, the rise of cyber attacks from both state and non-state actors, and the wider impact of technological developments and the increase in threat posed by terrorism, extremism, and instability. And as we go through this document, we see more and more. They're talking about state-based threats, intensification, Russia, of course, is the state-based threat that they're particularly concerned about. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, the allegation that Russia has fomented conflict in the Donbass, European countries, violated national airspace of European countries, and so on. Let's look at what else they were saying in here. Communications are increasingly being used by our partners and adversaries alike for strategic real-world advantage. Traditional channels have been largely discarded in favor of digital and social media platforms. So it's Russia, it's social media platforms. This is the concern. It went on. Building a culture of common purpose across departments requires improved accountability to shift incentives and behaviours towards a more general whole of government approach. So we're talking about the common purpose, we're talking about shifting behaviours, behavioural change, and the number of cadet units in schools across the country will expand. So we're going to get people in at the youngest possible age, get them into this new way of thinking.
Cadet units, what sort of cadets? Spy cadets or government operative cadets? Or they're not, it's not military explicitly, is it, Mike? This is, but they're using the word cadet, Mike.
Absolutely.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
What does that mean? Brown shirts, maybe, I don't know.
Yes, and so it went on, and we're taking a comprehensive approach to tackling the evil ideology of extremism, whether violent or non-violent, Islamist or far and extreme right wing. So this is quite incredible. A new intelligence framework is what they're talking about, and make community engagement a cornerstone of our response. So that's what Javid has really moved on with today. This is the first practical announcement following this fusion doctrine release. National resilience is truly collective, depending on all of us, emergency responders, local and central government, the armed forces, businesses, communities, and individual members of the public. This is top to bottom, from you as an individual right up to the highest levels of government, all integrated, all talking to each other, all making sure that the extremists are identified, labelled, and, well, what next? That's the question. Starting to lift them off the streets. We will continue, we will create a cross-government soft power strategy while respecting the independence of the BBC World Service, British Council, and many British institutions and brands that contribute to our soft power.
Soft power, where are they talking about? Global soft power? Or
yes.
are they talking about domestic soft power, Mike? Because you could also interpret this as that they're wanting to employ soft power domestically.
That's, I believe, exactly what they're intending to do.
That's interesting, because that's normally something that's projected outside in terms of a tool of foreign policy.
Absolutely. And this goes on with significantly expand the national security communications team to make communications an integral part of our approach to national security. Our industrial strategy will have transformed productivity and earning power, making the UK the world's most innovative economy. And so it goes on. You know, part and parcel of this, Patrick, is the establishment of a new role within the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and that is the head of counter-disinformation. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office didn't want to give any information about that role. I put a freedom of information request in 40 days ago now, asking what was the size of the team, what kind of budget do they have, these kinds of questions. And they said that they couldn't answer within the statutory 20-day period because there's a public interest test to be applied to this information, and that they would need a further 20 days to answer that. Well, they've got another 2 days in which to answer it. No sign of an answer just yet. They do not want to really give any indication as to what this role of counter-disinformation is, what size the team is within the Foreign Office, and so on. But in the meantime, we don't need to worry, because fusion doctrine being implemented, so the fact that the police, according to The Guardian, are facing a surge in extremists released from prison, we don't need to worry about that because it's all in hand.
Well, there's your problem right there. So, you know, what good is a solution if you can't present the problem beforehand? So there's the problem right there, Mike, which is this sort of, this idea that all these extremists will be, you know, released on the streets. So isn't it good timing that the fusion doctrine has arrived just in time?
Just in time.
Just in time to save us.
Just in time to save us. So The Guardian saying that more than 40% of the sentences for terrorism offences handed down over a 10-year period will have been served by the end of this year. That's according to figures from the Sentencing Council. And so there's a concern that some pretty high-profile names like Anjem Choudhury, for example, are going to be released this year. And these extremists are going to be murdering us in our beds.
Right. That's the idea there. But the reality is, Mike, is when you put someone like Mr. Choudhury back on the streets, he's a lightning rod for the tabloid media, much like Abu Hamza was for so many years with the hook. So that sort of riles up the other side of the political spectrum. And so we have a nice little polarization game going on. So that's a good time to implement this wonderful fusion doctrine, Mike.
Absolutely. Right. Let's move on. Roger Waters speaking out once again, this time concert in Berlin, where he's really making the point that Julian Assange continued to be under attack and that people should resist that.
If he did that in the O2 Centre in London, would that be considered extremism by Mr. Javid?
I believe it absolutely would be, yes.
Would Pink Floyd be falling foul of the new fusion counter-extremism doctrine, or the Foreign Office's counter-disinformation office might be interested in that? They might need to hack that video screen at the conference if that was taking place here, Mike, because those are extreme ideas being put forward by Roger Waters, talking about Julian Assange, very controversial character. You know, dangerous.
Dangerous stuff.
Dangerous stuff.
And dangerous stuff in Italy as well. They have a government, they don't have a government, now they seem to have a government again. But headlines continue to roll out on what's going on in Italy. Yeah,
so if you're not following the situation in Italy, so they finally managed to put together some sort of a working coalition government just over the weekend. And before that, the whole process was being held hostage by the appointment of a financial minister who was clearly anti-Euro, Mike. And so that caused the president, and in the Constitution of Italy, the president has the right to sort of veto the appointments to the ministerial positions, and that held up the whole process of putting a government together. They seem to have gotten through this, Mike, but this is only the beginning of the story. So what are we going to see in Italy? I personally think that we could see a rerun of what we saw in Greece a few years ago when Syriza came to power. It's arguably a lot easier to be in opposition than it is to be in power. And the problem is once you get into power and then the ECB and the technocrats start coming and meeting you and then telling you about all the debt that they have you saddled down with, and they could easily implode the Italian economy, Mike, and as they did with Greece during Syriza's rise to prominence. So what would happen if there was a major stock market crash or a bond crisis or a debt crisis in Italy? Who would get the blame? Of course, Mike, it would be the new five-star League coalition government, and therefore this would be used to sort of dampen public confidence in this new insurgent government in Italy, and therefore withal dash any hopes of any anti-EU or anti-Eurozone moves on the part of Italy in the future. The reality is, Mike, that they are so tied into debt, and that debt is spread all around Europe. I even think that Italy has a bond position in French banks even, so they're exposed in different countries on different fronts in terms of debt. So this is the thing with Europe, Mike, it's not easy to get out. It is a really all-encompassing system.
And in fact, I did notice just before the weekend that the threat of the IMF, potential IMF ex-IMF banker being parachuted back in again is still hanging over their heads.
It is, and this isn't the first time that happened, Mike. Only a few years ago, Mario Monti, three-card Monti, was brought in as marketed as a technocrat, really to sort of take, a Goldman Sachs man was put into power in Italy effectively, and that sort of dampened any hopes or any expectations that there would be sort of some major reform movement. That was pretty much squashed right at the onset.
Okay, let's move on to Brexit then. And the Financial Times headline here is Britain hints at staying in European VAT area after Brexit. So another day, another EU institution that we will not be leaving when we leave, apparently, if you can work that one out. Brexit without the exit, there's your hint. So what are they saying? Britain is taking what a minister has described as an active role in shaping new EU value-added tax regulations for the 2020s, suggesting the Treasury is planning for the UK to remain inside the bloc's VAT area after the Brexit transition period. In a letter seen by the Financial Times from Mel Stride, Financial Secretary to the Treasury, to Charlie Elphicke, MP for Dover, the Minister also says the government aims to keep VAT processes after EU exit as close as possible to what they are now. So they are now. Why would they want to do that? Well, you know, as you said to me before the programme, Patrick, you know, if we came out of the EU VAT system, we could perhaps, you know, set our own VAT rates, be a bit more competitive, maybe. But, well, see, the problem is there's this carousel fraud situation that has been making lots of people lots of money over the last lot of years. Because, of course, when products cross borders within the EU, they come across at zero rated, and then you charge the VAT in the local jurisdiction. And so people have been bringing goods from the mainland EU into Britain, selling them through a whole host of other companies, and then shipping them back to the originator, and of course leaving a company with a VAT bill after they've, you know, there's been VAT collected. That's gone into somebody's bank account, but that company disappears before the bill gets paid.
So imagine if Britain set its VAT rate, Mike, at 15%, just throwing a number out there, and then the rest of Europe is running at 20 or 22%, or whatever it is. Would that not give Britain a competitive advantage in terms of the import market? Could this be, you know, good in terms of negotiating better prices for goods and services in the British market? Certainly, this should be looked at, Mike, as a major advantage, being able to have an independent VAT rate, wouldn't you think?
No.
Possibly. Maybe.
Yeah. But Patrick, Brexit, you know, Brexit without the exit, we're staying in. This is all part of moving forward. We've got to only look forward in time. We don't want to look back in time. And we mentioned this last week with, I mean, this is mainly with regard to Brexit, I think. This is Demos, who have produced a report at Home in One's Past, Nostalgia as a Cultural and Political Force. This report has been published now. And it says, an appeal to a glorious past has been a prominent feature of European politics in recent years. While there are common elements to the nostalgic discourses seen across European politics, nostalgic narratives are clearly heavily mediated and contextualized by a nation's esoteric cultural and historical background. There you go. This report sets out the findings of our qualitative and quantitative research into nostalgia in contemporary Great Britain, France and Germany, three leading European nations in which the past feels ever present. And, you know, at the end of the day, what are they saying here? What are the conclusions? They're saying Britain, France and Germany are experiencing profound levels of social, economic and cultural transformation, and the breadth and depth of this change has been alienating for many of citizens to the extent that many feel unwilling or even incapable of looking to the future. Each country holds a varied and complex history of nostalgic narratives, some of which have gained renewed salience in a period in which citizens no longer accept a doctrine of progress. These narratives are being skillfully harnessed by insurgent politicians of various ideological inclinations to galvanize a force of protest against the status quo, rejecting a vision for the future that positions citizens as passive in the process of change. Those who benefit from citizens' anxieties about change are those peddling the promise of control, not just over immigration or laws, or even whether the national flag is displayed with gusto, but over time itself. Time is presented as a wild and unruly force which can be secured, regained and tamed. The cost of mainstream politicians failing to respond to these developments may well be our societies becoming more exclusionary and less communal, underpinned by more desperate, dangerous form of social competition, in short, the imperiling of our liberal democracies. Now, I just wanted to go back to the third paragraph there. These narratives are being skillfully harnessed by insurgent politicians of varied ideological inclinations to galvanize a force of protest against the status quo. Now, Patrick, I may be confused about the meaning of the term, but what does status quo mean? Mm-hmm. It means the established order of things, right? But what they're talking about here is people pushing back against change. Well, change is not status quo, is it?
Yes. The problem with, I don't know how to unpack this, Mike, what you just read there, but Demos is basically putting, this is a postmodernist, clearly, Mike, a deconstructionist, postmodernist think tank organization putting out deconstructionist, postmodernist ideas, and so they're wanting to, instead of appealing to a traditionalist past or seeing anything beneficial in terms of tradition. They're wanting to appeal to this dystopian future. So this kind of Euro theme park culture, this monoculture, this is clearly what Demos is presenting, which is no better than a nostalgic, antiquated traditionalist past that they're accusing traditionalists of invoking, Mike. So that's really what I see. This is definitely a pro-EU, a pro-Euro monoculture sort of document. And it's really attacking anybody with wanting to have any connection with the past or with traditions or the history of the country. You can't erase the history of the country, Mike.
Yes, I think it goes a little bit further than that as well, because of course what they're saying here is that people are finding it difficult to cope with the pace of change. We're driving this forward so fast. We've got to find ways to get people to let go of what has gone on in the past, let go of their past. You know, they don't want to have this anchor to tradition, to the common law, to our constitution. If we want what comes next, we've got to be willing to let that stuff go. So they are saying that they've got to get rid of the protest against the status quo. They've got to reject. They've got to get rid of this idea of rejection of what is being presented as the vision for the future. This is something that, of course, Theresa May has expressed her concern about rejection of globalization. And that really the way to deal with that is to throw a few bones at people that if they just throw a few more quid at them, they'll not worry about this too much.
They even use the word alienating.
Yes.
They admit in this document that this pace of change, as they call it, is alienating people, and this is one of the sort of causes for the discontent or the disconnect. So the fact that it's alienating large amounts of people, Mike, wouldn't you think that would trigger some kind of a more compassionate response from the state? But instead, this seems like they're wanting to bludgeon anybody who feels alienated with the club of progress. So you will conform
absolutely
to the status quo. I mean, that's kind of what I'm reading in this document, Mike. It's pretty, dare I say, diabolical in the rhetoric.
Well, it is diabolical in the rhetoric. So I was interested to know perhaps what influence was behind this. So here is the document itself. Nostalgia is a cultural and political force in Britain, France and Germany, at home in one's past, from Demos. Well, I have to say that the people in the chat box got it absolutely right, because if we remove the hidden element of this page, we find exactly who has funded this document, Open Society Foundation. So this is George Soros at his work in Britain once again. Now, there have been some pretty heavy headlines against George Soros in the mainstream media in recent days, but here is another example of him funding this type of well, I don't even know how to describe it.
Yeah, this is radical progressivism, an internationalized form of radical progressivism at its maximum.
Yes. The Russian embassy today was pushing this out, a quote from the Times, and in their tweet here they said, you don't have to be a criminal to be targeted by the UK, the National Crime Agency UK. Being Russian is enough. Thanks to the Sunday Times for explaining the new rule and how it works in 2018 Britain. And the key paragraph here is that the attack in Salisbury has accelerated our work around illicit finance against corrupt elites. So by definition, it increased the amount of work we've been doing against corrupt Russians or politically exposed Russians. So that is a bit of an extension beyond this notion of dirty money, dirty Russian money coming into the country. And I think the Russian embassy has a point.
Yeah, no, so it has nothing to do with the money, Mike, because as we know, most of the oligarchs who fled to the City of London to launder their money in the UK were probably more anti-Putin than anything else. So these would be natural allies with the Russia-phobic government at the moment in the UK. So it doesn't make much sense to want to be able to go and seize their capital unless it's just because they want to seize the capital, Mike, which of course there's probably a little bit of a financial motive there for some people.
Clearly in London there's going to be this massive clampdown on Russian money and anything to do with Russian money, which is why Deripaska, in an effort to avoid US sanctions, he's basically been told he has to sell his share of his metals company, energy and metals conglomerate, EM Plus. He has to sell that share. So who's going to do the work for him? Well, of course, it's going to be the London-based Rothschild Bank. Of course, who else would you choose? So that's good. We're not going to have any more Russian money in this country. We're not going to deal with Russians anymore in Britain, except when we are.
Except when they are kin, as it were. So this is another example of what we just said, Mike. So 2 sets of rules, I guess.
Absolutely, 2 sets of rules. Now, James Clapper, he's a good guy.
James Clapper, who managed to make the jump from the head of national intelligence in the U.S. to being a CNN commentator. So from one government department to another.
To another, yes.
So here he is, James Clapper, and some thoughts on Donald Trump. So what does Mr. Clapper have to say about Donald?
I'm going to ignore most of this interview. It was particularly election fraud that I was interested in here, because he was asked by Bloomberg, speaking of election interference, you write candidly in your book that the US has long tried to sway foreign elections where it had an important national interest, and you even cite a study of 81 examples. How do you square the current outrage over Russian manipulation of social media, which is kind of tame practice compared to some of the things that the CIA did? He said, I guess the way I think about it is that through our history, when we tried to manipulate or influence elections or even overturn governments, it was done with the best interests of the people in the country in mind, given the traditional reverence for human rights. And I have to say, Patrick, kind of speechless. I'm not really sure how to express what I think about that, because I'm not clear that I've seen quite such a degree of hypocrisy from anyone, I think.
What's interesting about Mr. Clapper is before he managed to wiggle into the head of national intelligence, he was, I believe, head of imaging or something like this in the federal government during the Iraq War period there in 2003. So he was also part of putting together all the sort of sexed up, dodgy intelligence. Certainly he was involved in that process to sort of perpetrate one of the greatest frauds in modern history, which was the case for WMDs in Iraq. And so isn't it funny that we have the same characters, Mike, not a decade and a half later, spinning a very similar set of lies for similar ends. So I don't think this man is very credible, and his own role in the dodgy dossier, for instance, him and John Brennan, is coming out now as we speak.
Well, we'll come on to that in 1 second, but just before we do, we'll mention this because naturally enough, RT has thought it useful to sort of list the number of countries that the US has either invaded or has attempted to intrude into domestic politics. That's quite a list.
That's a screenshot from Coups Are Us, which is a documentary film that was released by RT Documentaries a couple of weeks ago. It's up on 21st Century Wire right now. It was yesterday's Sunday screening, but there it is, Mike. It's quite a list in there. Include Hawaii. We shouldn't forget about the annexation of Hawaii, the illegal annexation of Hawaii that made it into a state. But there we go. It's just a who's list. There's a few left off there, Mike, which are unsuccessful coups, which did quite a lot of damage. But in recent years, you can see they've included the Ukraine, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Haiti, etc. And this is in RT, by the way. This is, I believe, Stephen Kissinger from the Boston Globe, the great journalist who, this is really all based on his work as a sort of a top-ranked U.S. journalist. So you can't blame RT or Russian Kremlin propaganda for that piece, because it's actually done by a leading award-winning American journalist.
On one hand, we have the US admitting election interference, 81 examples, in fact. On the other hand, we have the claim that Russia was interfering in US elections. But unfortunately for the people that are making that claim is falling down by the day. And in fact, it is becoming absolutely clearer by the day within the mainstream media that this was a British operation. The question has to be asked, Where does this leave the special relationship? So we've got The Hill here reporting London bridges falling down, curious origins of FBI's Trump-Russia probe. Well, I mean, I strongly recommend that people read this because it is very detailed. It does give a good explanation of what's going on. For example, they cite interviews with 3 former intelligence officers with knowledge of the corrupt criminal activity of the Obama CIA, and the UK's Joint Intelligence Committee was the venue used by the CIA and the DNI to share and receive intelligence allegedly linking Trump to Russia. So it's coming from the UK. It mentions Christopher Steele, it mentions Joseph Mifsud and Papadopoulos and all these people. So it's the networks that were involved in the creation of the dodgy dossiers, because of course there's more than one. I believe there's one still unpublished. This is absolutely coming right out into public awareness now. And you also wanted to mention this one.
Yeah, this is an article by Daniel Lazar, who's a very good writer. This was published on Consortium News. We've just republished Daniel Lazar's piece there, but with a little bit of commentary at the top. But the spooks spooking themselves was the headline of his article. And this really was I think he's one of the first authors to really put together a lot of the cast of characters and in an order that I think is understandable. Because, Mike, this is an incredibly complex web that is being woven here, and intentionally so, in order to obfuscate the plot, as it were. But essentially, Daniel Lazar is laying out what The Hill has reflected there on the weekend, which is that the deep state, if you will, in the United States, we're talking about members of the Obama administration. So this would be led by the Obama White House, and then sort of political allies in the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Justice, who then seem to have, and John McCain, by the way, he's the one that delivered the Scarlet Letter officially in the end, outsourced this to Britain. And in Britain, it was kind of done in a privatized fashion with the Dearlove gang. And you've mentioned some of those names before. And of course, you have Halpern and you have Misfood and some of these interesting agents of influence inserted in the middle there. And then you have an Australian diplomat and an Israeli, of course, an Israeli diplomat there, or an academic and diplomat right in the middle as the go-between and the middleman in order to send this conspiracy theory with Mr. Papadopoulos back to the United States, and then to give it oxygen. Very complicated affair, but the bottom line is, Mike, that it wasn't Russia meddling in the U.S. Elections. It seems to be Britain is the one who really has done the meddling, but at the behest of the members of their kindred spirits there in the U.S. deep state, who wanted some level of deniability. And so this wasn't done by the British government per se, but a lot of supposedly ex-intelligent operatives here in the UK, including, of course, the notorious Christopher Steele, would be the sort of fall guy in this story. But Christopher Steele is by no means the only actor in Team Britain.
No, absolutely not. Okay, but you know, Russia is killing stray dogs, Patrick. So we've got to continue to hit Russia. What's going on?
Well, another massacre here at the hands of the Russians. Apparently, Russia is killing stray dogs ahead of the World Cup, and the stars. The Guardian is calling on the football stars to stop this senseless slaughter. So Russia is guilty of some sort of crime here, killing its own domestic pets, apparently, ahead of the World Cup. So, yeah, so this is just the latest sort of string of propaganda, which is there's quite a few of these anti-Russian propaganda stories that are being put out to discredit the World Cup. There was all kinds of photo fakery a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you saw that with regards to the football hooligan scandal story that where our red top tabloids in the UK managed to spin that and misrepresent that story. But in the Sochi games, I think a few years ago, the talking point was that Russia was somehow clamping down or imprisoning or beating up gays or and LGBT persons in Russia. That turned out to be completely debunked and a fake story. But the propaganda penetrated the West. And so that's the whole name of the game. You need to get some degree of penetration on these talking points, whether it's Syria, Russia, or anything else. And then the damage is done, whether it's a real story or not. doesn't really matter because it just goes down the waterfall of the mainstream media content cascading process. But the idea, Mike, is to create this impression that bad things are happening in Russia associated with the World Cup.
Of course, we never did find out what happened to the homeless people that were swept off the streets of Windsor for the royal wedding. So you know, is Russia really deserving of criticism here? Anyway, let's move on because we got to keep the pressure on Russia. And here we go. This is this is Bob Seeley, MP on the right, who has offered what's being described as the first comprehensive definition of the nature of modern Russian warfare in a peer-reviewed paper for the Henry Jackson Society. So this is peer-reviewed. Who would be reviewing this?
What sort of peers are reviewing this paper? Okay.
That's a very good question. And apparently it draws a direct comparison between Cold War era KGB active measures and the aggression of Putin's Russia. So there you go. A definition of contemporary Russian conflict. How does the Kremlin wage war is what the report is called, if you want to look for it. It warns that the West faces a new kind of conflict, one in which military and non-military tools are combined in a dynamic, efficient and integrated way to achieve political aims. Until now, there have been no common agreement on what it was we're fighting, but Seeley offers a comprehensive definition. Apparently in his paper, Conservative MP and Russian researcher Seeley offers the term contemporary Russian conflict to describe the covert and overt forms of malign influence used by the Kremlin. A definition of contemporary Russian influence examines the ways in which Russia goes to war and how it came to adopt this hybrid warfare model, and it highlights apparently how the Kremlin considers non-military tools to be potentially more powerful than military tools, with instruments such as information warfare, cultural manipulation, and social media hacktivism being used to achieve foreign policy goals without the need for direct force. Is that not what the definition of soft power? Is that not something that Britain has been doing for centuries and is actually pretty good at?
And the United States as well, absolutely.
So there is an enduring influence, he says, of the secret services on Russian strategic planning, with the stages of contemporary Russian conflict based heavily on the active measures toolkit used by the KGB in political warfare during the Soviet Union period. President Putin and security clique around him, judging by foreign defense and security doctrine, believe that the Western system, based on the rule of law and universal human rights, is antithetical to Russia, and that the West is an adversary, not a partner of Russia, with Russia a victim of Western action. This is another example of turning reality 180 degrees on its head, because if I replaced President Putin with Theresa May, or particularly with Theresa May, then it would work.
Or Tony Blair.
Or Tony Blair, right? Because it is Britain that considers that Russia is an adversary, not a partner, and it is Britain that that considers Russia the threat to the rules-based system, as they like to define. Russia is a threat to the rules-based system because the rules-based system is not the system of international law that actually countries should be working by.
He's got a touch of Nick Clegg, doesn't he? That little sort of that grin. Got a little touch
well, he said that Putin's tactics owe much to the active measures practiced by the KGB, as I say, subverting truth to undermine our faith in our institutions. Yes.
So again, that is Orwellian inversion there, Mike. So the malign influence that Russia apparently has is somehow undermining policies or changing. So how is this? If Russia is engaged in information warfare, is that changing the policies of UK lawmakers, Mike, and UK policymakers? Because it doesn't seem to be that they're doing anything pro-Russian over the last few years. So what effect does it have? What are they talking about? They're talking about influencing the voters. They're very careful not to go that far in that paper, Mike, but the malign influence seems to be telling the truth about major international events, whether they be Syria, whether they be Yemen, whether they be what's happening in Palestine. That's somehow undermining what they're calling the rule of law or the rules-based international order. Anything, Mike, that any reporting that falls out of that banned that narrative, that prescribed narrative, is now labeled as hybrid warfare by the U.S. and UK Mandarin bureaucratic class. So they're upset because Russia is exercising soft power. And quite a few other countries do the same, Mike, in different ways, including China. But of course, no one wants to take on China, do they?
Not yet.
Not yet.
We'll see. Now, in the meantime, Benjamin Netanyahu is on his way to Europe. And you caught this, what was this, the Telegraph this morning?
No, well, this beauty here was in the Times, of course.
In the Times.
So the main headline here is "Secret Files Prove Iran is Trying to Build a Bomb. Israel urges the EU to tear up the Iran nuclear deal." Here's a little snippet from that article. Now, this is not news, Mike. This is basically recycling Bibi Netanyahu's PowerPoint presentation from a month ago. So this is a favor. Rupert Murdoch has allowed Israel to basically have the front page of the Times today to recycle some month-old propaganda. So A, it's not newsworthy. B, it's fake news because Iran is not developing a nuclear weapons program right now, according to international inspectors, but they want you to believe the conspiracy theory, which is being spun up by Israel, that somehow they are. But just looking at the text there, so Israel raised the pressure on Britain and its European partners last night to tear up the nuclear deal with Iran. And by sharing secrets, showing Tehran's determination to build a bomb, they haven't shown them anything, Mike.
So has
old documents from 15 years ago.
Has Bibi packaged up all those CDs that he DVDs that he had shown on screen? He's packaged them up and sent a copy to everybody in Europe. Is that what he's up to?
Yeah, that looked like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Wall of Fame with all the CDs on it. But so yeah, they are repackaging it, Mike, and they're using the Times, using the Murdoch press as the vehicle for recycling this. So spin again, repeat, spin again, recycle.
Well, in the meantime, Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, has been speaking to Spiegel Online, to Der Spiegel in Germany, and he's saying that NATO is not obliged to come to the rescue should there be a war between Israel and Iran. He said Israel is our partner but is not a member of NATO. The security guarantee of Article 5 does not apply to Israel. And he said it's not NATO's job, basically, to protect Israel should they do something silly in this area. He said that would such a hypothetical war break out, it remains an open question if the US unilaterally would rush to defend its closest ally, but NATO certainly wouldn't be getting involved from day one. We're equally concerned about Iran's missile program, he said, and its activities leading to instability in the region, for example, the support of terrorist groups. But he said the Iran agreement continues. In the meantime, the question is, can it work without the US? The impact of US sanctions on European companies will be huge in any case. So NATO apparently taking a back step on this one.
Look, the first thing I have to correct Stoltenberg. Iran had launched a missile to hit ISIS targets in Syria last June, or June 2017. So that was done in coordination with the Syrian government. Of course, they're not happy about that. Iran being able to hit ISIS targets, God forbid. But what they're also trying to do, Mike, is build up a case that somehow Iran is responsible for the war that Saudi Arabia, the UK, and the US are prosecuting in Yemen now since 2015. So again, it's trying to smooth that part of history over, respin it.
In the meantime, Baghdad, Iraq, has denied, according to RT, that the US is setting up a base in Iraq-Syria border, or at the Iraq-Syria border. What's the background to this? That would be a pretty difficult, what's the word? It would be an inflammatory thing for them to do.
Well, what the U.S. is trying to do is to take sectarian sides here now. Now that ISIS is effectively defeated in Iraq, the United States is still wanting to occupy Iraq under the guise of defeating the final last pockets of ISIS. And I can tell you, Mike, from my experience in that country, that if the U.S. were to sort of withdraw from Iraq, they would probably mop up any of the remaining pockets of ISIS within weeks, maybe months, and in Syria, probably the same within weeks and months. But because the U.S. are maintaining a presence there, It's my opinion and the opinion of many others that the U.S. is managing the problem of ISIS. So, but that's been sort of denied about this base in Mount Sinjar, a permanent base by the United States. And of course, the U.S. are upset, Mike, because the most powerful on the ground, most influential military force in Iraq right now are the PMUs, the People's Mobilization Units, who are primarily Shiite. And so we're getting a huge amount of support from Iran. In fact, if it wasn't for the PMUs, also known in Iraq as the Hashd al-Shabi, ISIS would probably still be running rampant across large sections of Iraq right now if it wasn't for the PMU, 120,000 strong. And they're not all Shiites, Mike, by the way. There are Sunni units of the PMU. They're Christian, they're Yazidi, they're Turkmen, and different ethnic and religious factions who are also part of the People's Mobilization Units, although the majority are Shiite. And yes, they have a huge amount of support from Iran because the Iraqi state didn't have the wherewithal in terms of finance and military support to prosecute that war against ISIS. So the U.S. was not supplying the amount of support on the ground. They're flying airstrikes, which some reports by Iraq are, Mike, that they're charging the Iraqi government for air sorties. Just as the Saudi Arabia war against Yemen, the U.S. are invoicing Saudi Arabia for their military services. This is the new Hessian Army of the United States of America, this new corporate defense force for hire, essentially. This is the new U.S. Business model for prosecuting war globally.
Syria is seeking to recapture the southwest.
So this is related to the last story, and what's interesting here, so the southwest, and so in terms of Syria, they're wanting to, U.S. is wanting to open up some, talks or multilateral talks with regards to what's going to happen here, and one of the final remaining pockets of extremists in Syria, as the Syrian army are making headway towards Daraa and towards Quneitra and the occupied Golan region. This is becoming a bit of a panic stations for the U.S., Israel, and Jordan, all three of which have been instrumental in destabilizing the southern part of Syria now for the last 7 years. And so the Syrian foreign minister, Walid al-Bualem, basically said to the U.S., yeah, we'll talk about the South. We'll talk about the South when the U.S. withdraw their troops from Al-Tanf. So when the U.S. get out of Al-Tanf, which is on the Iraqi-Syrian border, which is related to the last story about that permanent base in Sinjar, Mike, because what the United States are trying to do is operationalize the border between Iraq and Syria. And so by doing that, they will be able to control the destiny of the sort of stability or instability of Syria and that part of Iraq for years to come. So certainly they want to have a presence there. And it's no surprise, Mike, that there are ISIS units who are sort of active alongside of U.S. units in the same vicinity. Like I said, Mike, if the United States were out of Syria, there would be no ISIS and would be a matter of weeks or months.
Okay.
And by the way, Jan Stoltenberg, this is a good point, Mike. Jan Stoltenberg, who met the Iraqi prime minister in March, basically said that NATO forces would remain in Iraq. Smoothly done, Mike. Smoothly done. So I didn't realize NATO was deployed in Iraq. So that was in that Reuters article that we just showed, if people want to go and look it up.
That's that one.
Yeah. So
Syrian government seeks to recapture southwest. Foreign minister, if anybody wants to find that.
So are NATO planning to do an Afghanistan eventually with Iraq? In other words, make it a NATO police action or a NATO stabilization action like they have done in Iraq. And that takes the heat politically off the United States because they're able to launder that operation through a multilateral organization like NATO. That to me, Mike, looks like this is the game. So when NATO says they won't be deploying anything in Syria, I wouldn't believe that for a second if you look at the long-term issues at play here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Patrick, for joining us today. I'm afraid we're completely out of time, so I'll have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back at the same time, 1 p.m. as usual tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.